hope about a vaccine restoring some of the old normal, sort of a reverse start date in a certain way. And I think there's no better time than when we're defining a new start date for ourselves than right now to energize the change in ourselves and our larger communities around racial justice and anti-racist work. The Unitarian Universalist Association, through its Commission on Institutional Change, has laid out guiding principles with which to address our work to end systemic oppression in our association. I want to be clear about the use of the word principle here. On Sundays, we typically and almost exclusively use principle to represent our 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. The guiding principles the Commission has invoked are distinct from our typical reference to those 7 principles. These are specific principles for specific actions addressing systemic oppression in our association. I thank Ellen for introducing the Commission's report entitled Widening the Circle of Concern at an October service. There is a full-blown report, but there's also a full-blown study guide that has just been published by the UUA that covers all 11 sections of the report. The study guide represents, if we implement it, when we implement it, it will be a 3 to 4 month project for us and other congregations to work through all the guiding principles in the report. So it's 11 90-minute sessions. So we'll work on that later. But before we get started with that, the development of that study group, I had an idea that, before the full-blown project gets underway, I thought I would try to introduce some of the report's individual guiding principles during my talks on Sunday. And I'll admit, I particularly wanted to start the year with a reference to the report. And I further figured I'd like to start with the first chapter of the report. But before I go on, I'm going to also admit my self-doubt about my plan to launch us into pieces of this discussion without the whole study guide laid out like a net catching us and ready before us. I want to make clear that today's talk is an introduction to the language of the Commission's report and to the scope of the ideas and discussions congregations across the country will be undertaking in 2021. I am resolved to begin our new start with what I see as a profound new start within Unitarian Universalism. So the report's first chapter is entitled Theology. And there are 2 guiding principles I'd like to pull out from there that I'd like to share with you. The first says, we have work to do to more deeply understand the theology we've inherited and the theology we proclaim as Unitarian Universalists. The second one reads, we must center the theological work of Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, and scholars of color, both professional and lay, whose knowledge is resonant for our times. And the report further implores us that to keep Unitarian Universalism alive, we must center the voices that have been silenced or drowned out and dismantle elitist and exclusionary white privilege, which inhibits connection and creativity. So I want to look at the first guiding principle, the work we need to do to understand our inherited theology. I'll bet the very mention of a inherited UU theology may be startling to some of us. And I think there are a couple of assumptions that might lend it to be startling, because these are sometimes prevalent among UUs. And the first is that I think many folks think that you can believe whatever you want to be a Unitarian Universalist. There's an idea that our shared faith presents us with a kind of a theological container in which we can hold multiple religious belongings and theological understandings. Well, the report writers state clearly that the idea that you can believe whatever you want to be a Unitarian Universalist is not valid. They write, we have a theological container within which we can hold a wide range of beliefs about God, about how to practice one's faith, and about how to live. Because we live at the intersection of multiple traditions, defining this container is essential. So it's not formally defined for us, but this is the exciting piece of our work in 2021, as far as I can see. We're going to be defining our theological container, that which is in it, that which lives in our hearts and lives in that container. The second assumption that I think is somewhat prevalent, maybe less obvious than the first, but prevalent amongst you is that we are a community that puts an emphasis on rejected beliefs. Many of us are so glad to find a group of people welcoming to our questioning of our experience of other faith practices that we focus on a rejection of those practices that didn't work for us. The report calls on us to confront our emphasis on rejected ideas when they declare, in an age when so many struggle to find meaning, a community formed through a set of commonly held beliefs can form a stronger bond than one formed through antipathy towards rejected beliefs. I think this can be a powerful bit of self-reflection and ultimately collective reflection to find out how we as a community can move away from an attitude that puts emphasis on rejected beliefs. How can we move toward commonly held beliefs and practices based on our inherited tradition? And how can those shared beliefs and practices be a resource of hope as we search for meaning? The second guiding principle that I mentioned, that to keep Unitarian Universalism alive, we must center the voices that have been silenced or drowned out and dismantle elitist and exclusionary white privilege, which inhibits connection and creativity, is what I'd like to respond to in the second half of my talk here today. And I hope you'll recognize that it really isn't me talking to do that response. We are called on to center the theological work of Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, and scholars of color, both professional and lay, whose knowledge is resonant for our times. So I sought out the theological work of a Black scholar and found the work of the Reverend James Cone to be a profound voice. Reverend Cone was born in 1938 in Arkansas and lived in the Jim Crow South. In 1970, he became a professor at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and he stayed at Union for over 40 years, and he passed away in 2018. Reverend Cone defined his work as a theologian, and I think in practice the meaning or the worthiness of theology in his 1970 book, A Black Theology of Liberation. He wrote, "I was determined to speak a liberating word to and for African American Christians, using the theological resources at my disposal. I did not have time to do the theological and historical research needed to present a balanced perspective on the problem of racism in America. Black men, women, and children were being shot and imprisoned for asserting their right to a dignified existence. Others were wasting away in ghettos, dying from filth, rats, and dope, as white and Black ministers preached about a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus who came to make us all just like him. I had to speak a different word, not just as a Black person, but primarily as a theologian. I felt that if theology had nothing to say about Black suffering and resistance, I could not be a theologian." Reverend Cohn's sense of theological urgency is present in all his writings and his talks. And in the spirit of centering on his words, and with Leonard's great help today, thank you, Leonard, we're going to try and let us all listen directly to them. There's a couple of videos that we're going to pull clips from in the next 8 to 10 minutes here. One of the videos I know was made in 2009, and the other one I can't date, but I'm just trying to look for clues, and I think it's similar to that time. Further, as an introduction, I want to recognize that Reverend Cohn is not at all writing or speaking about our inherited UU theology, but I am confident that his experiences and thought can inform the theology that we ultimately proclaim. Let's listen to the first video, Leonard, if we can.
Professor James Cohn, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you.
What did you draw on to do your theology? As a professor, as an author?
It was trying to bring together Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement together with the Black Power movement, this symbol of being black in a white racist society. King interpreted the gospel in such a way in which the blackness of his identity was not at the center. Malcolm, a Muslim, rejected Christianity because it did not address his blackness. So, I wanted to address my blackness, but yet at the same time, I was a Christian. I was born a Christian. I couldn't leave that. That faith was the center of my life. But the way in which that faith had been interpreted in the seminary and also generally in the dominant interpretation of it in America, which King largely adopted, also had a white Jesus. Now, how are you going to get a European white Jesus in Palestine? You can't get that. But with white theologians, you can get almost anything out of Jesus. So they had reinterpreted Jesus so he looked like them. So I wanted to bring the blackness of my identity together with the faith that I had learned in the church. And it was that brought me to want to interpret the Christian gospel. So, in black theology, which I developed, the blackness in that phrase comes from Malcolm X. The theology in it comes from Martin King. So I bring Martin and Malcolm together, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement together in order to develop a black theology of liberation.
So I've watched the clip several times. So I clearly wrote down coming out of that one that Cohn looked to merge the blackness of his identity together with the faith he had learned in the church. We're going to go on here. In the second clip, Reverend Cohn describes his posture in two books he wrote. In the first one in 1969 was entitled Black Theology and Black Power. And the second was written in 1970, is the book A Black Theology of Liberation. You'll hear him speak about his anger didn't diminish after writing the first book or even after writing the second book. There you go. Let's go on to that one.
But when I moved to a black theology of liberation, I am writing to white theologians, black theologians, but particularly white theologians. Because I'm madder in the second book than I was in the first. It's just that the only people who experience that anger are people working in theology. Because I'm working with what the gospel is. See, in black theology, black power, I'm trying to encourage a black freedom movement that what they are doing is actually an expression of the highest divine work in this world. And I'm trying to help us see it in secular expressions. I'm trying to help us see it in the very people who don't think of themselves as Christians. But in Black Theology Liberation, I want to write to the Christians. I want to write to the white Christian church, to white theologian, black theologian, to anybody who claims their identity with the Christian gospel. And in Black Theology Liberation, I just want to shape an understanding of the gospel that places the liberation of the poor and the weak at the heart. And anybody who does not address that cannot claim to have a Christian gospel. It may be some other kind of gospel, but it's not the Christian gospel. And so there is where I'm pressing that. And I'm using a language that theologians can understand, a language that preachers can understand, a language that Christians feel comfortable with. And I wanna say it as sharp and as direct as I can. That was the book. Black Theology Liberation is the one that most theologians have the most difficult with. Not Black Theology and Black Power.
Not the first one, not the first.
So not the first one.
Yeah.
So so there's a little thing. People always saying, did some of the anger soften? No, they never softened in 40 years. I'm still feeling it. I'm still feeling it. I thank everybody for this award, but I'm still feeling it.
So just to make sure you know, he was receiving a prestigious award in Montreal at that where he was talking, and he was just reiterating that he's still feeling the anger that rises up in him when folks claim to be Christian but don't center on the poor and the dispossessed. In the next clip, Reverend Cohn refers to Charles Long, and Long is a professor of religion and a contemporary of Reverend Cohn. And I think Cohn's comments in the next clip give a quick definition of the role of the theologian and the role of theology. So let's go on to the next one, Leonard.
Trying to do. One is, I was not trying to say the last word on anything, as I said yesterday. I was not. I was not trying to give a balanced interpretation of what black religion is all about. I was intentionally trying to be as one-sided in what I said as I possibly could. Because I think the truth, when it comes in a situation of injustice, is always one-sided. And people are always upset with it. So I intended to speak that way. Now, my debates with Charles Long is that we were doing two different things. Charles Long is one of the most sophisticated academics I know. And his understanding of black religion taught me a lot. But I wasn't writing about black religion. I was not writing about that. That's his area. I was not writing about. I'm a theologian writing about what the hell is the Christian gospel all about. That's all I was asking. And how does that understanding shape how the church ought to preach its message and live that gospel? That's all I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to give a sophisticated analysis of black religion as Charles Long was doing, and I learned a lot from him. We were just concerned about different things. Mine was sharply political, intended to be so. I wanted to write about the crucified people in my community. I wanted to say a word that they could say, yes, you're right, son. I wanted them to feel empowered by their culture, by their history, by their understanding of the Christian faith. So my work was intended for the Christian community and anybody else who want to listen to us.
Okay. So I'm just going to go on from that one. The last clip looks at theology and its practice in religion and offers us a piece of what for Reverend Cohn is hopeful. Let's try that one, Leonard.
There's one view that the world's religions, that each monotheism is a self-contained truth system, and that they must therefore necessarily be in conflict. How do you view different religions?
See, I don't think any religion is a self-contained system of truth. Not absolute. I think they're all human expressions searching for God's truth. But that's not God speaking. Not literally so. Oh no. People who think so, they can kill you in the name of God. And I saw a lot of people in the South doing that to black people. When they lynched black people, it was a religion encouraging them to do that. There's one white historian who has written an essay in which he says, religion was the religion of the white Southerner who lynched. Just like it's the religion of people who kill people today. I don't go with that. I do not think that any religion that's good, a good religion as we used to say, there's good religion and bad religion. A good religion does not kill.
What can an individual, or perhaps it's a small congregation, do to address this, to move in this direction, to start to transform the way that religion works in this country?
They have to bear witness to the God that they know and hate all injustice, be enraged about it, and to organize to fight it, to join movements of justice. That's the way you fight it.
You've been working on this issue, racial reconciliation, for 40 years, you just said. And the United States is arguably more segregated than it's ever been.
Yes.
What keeps you going? Where do you find hope?
I find hope in the gospel. And when I hear that preached, when I see people bearing witness to the gospel, when I see people who recognize what justice is in this society and in this world. You know, people in power have more power today than they ever had before. But people are resisting that power. Small, powerless people. I see hope when I see weak, powerless, poor people standing up and resisting the inhumanity that's being inflicted. That gives me hope, because I know God is still present in the world when I see little people resisting the violence that's in this world. That's where I see the hope. Remember, Jesus was basically unknown. I mean, he was not a very famous person. So if hope can come out of the crucifixion, out of the cross, then it can come out of the little crosses that I see people who have to bear, the cross of white supremacy, and I see people bearing witness against that. That's where my hope comes from.
Professor Cohn, thank
you. So look, I don't doubt that these clips are enormously incomplete glimpses of Reverend Cohn's thought. And I'm not going to summarize or interpret this brief introduction to the work of Reverend Cohn. I offered this introduction today as a starting point in our congregational work to respond to the Commission's report. As I said earlier, I wanted to begin this new start of 2021 with a look at the new start we're asked to consider and embrace in Unitarian Universalism. Looking forward from today, we've got work to do to more deeply understand the theology we've inherited and the theology we proclaim. The work of Reverend Cohn, James Baldwin, and Howard Thurman, who we've heard from in past Sundays, and many more who we will be listening to, will be part of the many voices that must be listened to as we explore and define what ultimately will live in the theological container for the future of Unitarian Universalism. Thank you. Let's hear from Alex.